بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إكمالا للفصول السابقة راح نتكلم إكمالا لمواضيع المتعلقة ببعض العناصر deductions من ضمنها losses and bad debts, which is chapter 8 sorry. chapter 8 يتكلم عن أو بمعنى آخر ممكن أن احنا نسردها ك when you're done with chapter 8 راح يكون عندك more knowledge about identifying like transaction that may result in losses, determine the proper classification for losses, examine the tax treatment of passive losses, identify and calculate the deduction for a casualty or theft losses, compute the deductions for bad debt, computing the operating losses deduction. كل هذه إن شاء الله راح يكون الطالب able to it. نتكلم عن net operating losses, tax planning consideration, all of this matter. So a tax buyer أو دافعي الضرائب بشكل عام they often sustain losses in property that they sell or exchange or dispose. من وين تجي الخسارة؟ there is a major discussion related to this matter. Starting with the transactions may result in losses. فنبدأ بأول نقطة راح نتكلم فيها هي وش اللي يؤدي أو العمليات أو المعاملات اللي تؤدي إلى خسائر. من ضمن ال transaction that may result in losses اللي هي sales or exchange of property. من أول المعاملات اللي قد ينتج عنها خسارة محققة أو خسارة ممكن يعترف فيها دافع الضريبة هي بيع الخسارة من بيع الممتلكات أو تبادل الممتلكات أو ممكن أنه تكون الممتلكات هذه صودرت من قبل جهة الاباندمنت كذلك worthless securities إذا كانت الورقة المالية اللي كان يملكها الشخص هذا أصبحت عديمة القيمة عامل الهدم عامل الكاجوالري always an ordinary losses ممكن السرقات الأعراض المشاكل اللي تحصل في السوق قد تؤثر على أو تحصل في الاقتصاد البلد يؤثر فتحصل بسببه الخسائر هذه. Our discussion will be related to this matter. Okay, so we will start first with the sales or sale or exchange of property. The amount of loss a tax buyer incurs in a sale or exchange of property equals the excess of the property adjusted basis over the amount realized for the property. Okay, so it's equal to adjusted basis minus amount realized. The amount, our realized amount include the money plus the FMV of other property received. كذلك amount realized increases with the liabilities transferred. A selling cost deductible only if property held for مثلا property inventory. If not, they must or they just actually reduce the amount realized. Okay, so طبعا ال FMV للتوضيح اللي هي fair market value. If the property sold or exchanged subject to mortgage or other liability, the amount realized by the tax buyer also include the amount of the liability transferred to the buyer. فبشكل عام the tax buyer can only deduct losses they incurred in the sale or exchange if property used in a trade or business or held for investment. The taxpayer cannot deduct losses they incur in the sale or exchange of personal use property. Abandoned property. Abandoned هي طبعا when this is for held for investment لما يجي سؤال for example فيما يخص متى يمكن اللي يدفعون الضرائب انهم يخصموا الخساره بشروط، واذا كانت تستخدم في مثلا trade of business it's used in trade or held for investment، فمن خلالها يجوز له خصم الخسائر. وراح ننظر الى امور so it's held for business for investment or used in trade of business. abandoned property اللي هي الممتلكات اللي هجرت. if property become worthless إذا أصبحت ممتلكاتنا والأشياء اللي احنا نملكها عديمة القيمة وتم التخلي عنها، الخسارة هنا تساوي الأساس أو يسمونها الخسارة تسمى adjusted basis. Okay. Again, we must be used for investment, so it is an ordinary loss. If depreciable مثل الآلات فيجب إنه يتم it must be physically abandoned، فتعتبر خسارة عادية إذا كان لها استهلاك مثل الآلات. Okay. Abandoned property, if a taxpayer actually if the taxpayer's property become worthless or is not worth repairing in order to return the property to serviceable condition, the taxpayer may simply abandon the property. If the property still has basis, the taxpayer realizes a loss. Okay. فالtaxpayer هنا في الحالة may not deduct such losses if the property is personal use property. ما يسمح له إنه إذا كانت personal use unless it was a business use property. Okay. بالنسبة للنقطة الأخرى we covered this one as well. Worthless security. Worthless security اللي هي الأوراق المالية اللي أصبحت لها قيمة. Deductions only available in a year that is become worthless. So it's treated as a capital loss on last day of the year. Corporations may deduct an ordinary loss if they own 80% of the bankrupt company's shares and 90% of it is non-passive. إذا التاكس باير راح يسمح له إنه يخصم جزء من مصروفات for securities that become completely worthless خلال السنة، لأنه deduction هنا is only available for the year the security actually becomes worthless. So both the taxpayers and the IRS may have problems determining the tax, determining the year in which the securities become worthless. So this is the only problem that we are going to face. So securities must be completely worthless. A capital loss on the last day of the tax law. So we must show security is completely worthless and the last security become worthless during the year. طبعا under certain circumstances of it. نتكلم هنا عن domestic corporation, that is deductions, the loss must own at least 80% or more than 90% of the affiliated corporation gross receipt for all its taxpayers or taxable years must be from non-passive income. الخصم متاح هنا فقط في العام اللي أصبحت فيه الورقة عديمة الجدوى أو عديمة القيمة. طبعا هنا تعامل كخسارة رأسمالية في آخر يوم من العام. يعني نتكلم عن الخاص. يجوز الشركة أنها تقتطع جزء من الخسارة العادية هذه إذا كانت تملك مثلا 80% من أسهم الشركة اللي أفلست، و90% من 90% of the affiliated corporation gross receipt for all of the tax years must be actually from non-passive income. Classifying the loss on the taxpayer's tax return. If a loss is deductible, the taxpayers must determine whether the loss is an ordinary loss or a capital loss. So in addition, individual taxpayers must also identify the deductible amounts as either a deduction for or from adjusted gross income. نتكلم عن ordinary versus capital losses، بنتكلم عن كذلك عن passive losses إن شاء الله in just a second. All right. So whether a deductible loss is ordinary or capital يعتمد على a type of property involved. So transaction in which the taxpayer sustains the loss. So to incur the capital loss, a sale or exchange of a capital asset must occur. So if both elements, sale or exchange and the capital asset, are not present, a deduction generally is an ordinary loss. All assets except inventory, notes, and account receivable, so inventory, note receivable, account receivable, and depreciable property and land used in trade or business, هذه تعتبر all classified as a capital asset because a casualty is not sale or exchange. So الاوردينري versus اللي هو الخسائر العادية مقابلة بالخسائر الرأسمالية، تعتمد على نوعية الملكية، نوعية الأصل، نوعية المعاملة مع هذا الأصل. في سكشن 1231 تكلم عن البروبرتي بشكل خاص. بعد ذلك السكشن ناقش صافي الخسارة أو صافي الخسارة العادية وتكلم عنها. كذلك let's include real or depreciable property that use the business or trade and held for more than 1 year. فيشمل هذا الأمر الممتلكات العقارية وقابل للاستهلاك مستخدمة في الأعمال التجارية واللي تم الاحتفاظ بها لفترة من الزمن. طبعا السكشن 1231 it's whether a loss on a particular transaction is treated as a capital loss may also depend on the gains or losses that taxpayers reported from other property transaction for the tax year. So, for example, and the other section related to the discussion for stock, taxpayers generally recognize capital gain or losses on the sale of exchange or securities. For individuals, the tax law provides an exceptions for losses from the sale or worthlessness of a small business corporation. So to qualify the loss as ordinary under section 1244, the following requirement must be met. من ضمن الريكويرمنت انه the stock must be owned by the individual or the partnership. هذا الخطوه الطلب الاول او الريكويرمنت من المتطلب رقم 1. متطلب رقم 2 انه stock must have been originally issued by the corporation to the individual or to the partnership in which an individual is a partner. طبعا هنا stock received in certain recognition of corporation in exchange for section 1244 stock is also considered in this matter. A stock must be stock in a domestic US corporation. وكذلك the taxpayer must have received the stock in exchange for cash or property other than stock or securities that the taxpayer contributed to the corporation. So the stock issued to the taxpayers for services rendered is not eligible or illegal for section 1244 treatment. ذكر كذلك two other requirements من ضمنها انه الcorporation must not have derived over 50% of its gross receipt from passive income sources during the 5 tax years immediately preceding the tax year of sale or worthlessness. كذلك the amount of money and property contributed to both capital and paid in surplus may not exceed 1 million at the time the corporation issues the stock. Disallowance possibilities. All right. A tax law may disallow or defer losses incurred in certain transactions and activities. Some of these transactions تشمل transfers of property to controlled corporation and exchange of stock of the corporation, exchange of property for other property considered to be like kind to property given up. Most of these, for example, the transfer of property we discussed in chapter 2. تذكرون الcity او apprentice hall visual taxation that we discussed earlier. Property sold to certain related parties. These in chapter 6, الwash sale في chapter 6 in chapters 6 and 7 wash sale transaction losses limited because of the losses exceed the amount of for which the taxpayers is at risk. Passive losses. Passive losses هي نوع من الخسائر. تعالوا نعرفها بشكل أوضح. It's netted within activity first and then used to offset gain of other passive activity. So if passive activity is sold to unrelated party, it to offset active income of that year after reducing passive income. So some of the losses and gain of these losses of the losses of the sale activity, we're gonna offset income from other passive activities within this, and then we use the remaining portion to offset active income. هذا النوع من الخسائر يتم حصرها ضمن مثلا نشاط معين اولا، ثم يتم استخدامها للتعويض عن المكاسب للانشطه الباسف الاخرى. فاذا تم مثلا بيع نشاط باسف الى طرف ليس له صله مثلا بالنشاط، فيمكن ان احنا نستخدمه اثناء للتعويض بهذا الشكل من خلال جمع الخسائر والمكاسب لهذا النشاط مقابلة الدخل من الأنشطة الباسف الأخرى. كذلك نستخدم الجزء المتبقي للتعويض بهذا الشكل وهكذا. Suspending losses at time of death. I think we are yeah. So this is the passive losses competition of passive losses and credits. In enacting the passive loss rules, Congress did not want to prevent taxpayers from currently deducting or using losses and credits generated in active business. So in endeavors of the taxpayers. So at the same time, Congress realized that a certain investments, such as investments that generate interest or dividends income, it normally give rise to taxable income, which could itself be sheltered by losses and credits that arise in other passive activities. الكومبيتيشن اوف باسيف لosses هنا نقصد احنا في الكومبيتيشن انه income is classified into 3 categories: active income, portfolio income, وpassive income. الاكتيف income او الدخل النشط هذا ينتج من الاجور، من الرواتب، من العمل المباشر، من الدخل التجاري والانشطه التجاريه. So it's result from wages, direct work, من السالاريز، من الاكتيف بزنس، من الاكتيف بزنس انكم، كل هذه resulting from it. portfolio income او هذا النوع من الدخل ينتج من الرنت royalties and interest، ينتج من بعض الفوائد، بعض الإيجارات وما يسمى بالإتاوة أو غيرها من الأمثلة على الرويالتيز. الباسيف income, net income loss or loss will be calculated for each activity. So passive losses can offset passive income only. في الدخل هذا النوع من الدخل راح نحسب صافي الدخل او صافي خساره لكل نشاط على حده. الخسائر هذه او الخسائر اللي تعتبر باسيف في هذا النظام يمكن انها تعوض الدخل الباسيف income only for a specific activity. Carry over. All right. A taxpayer, they carry over disallowed passive activity losses indefinitely and treat them as losses allocable to that specific passive activity in the following tax years. So راح يحملونها على السنوات القادمة. Tax buyers may use these losses اللي يسمونها suspended losses to offset passive activity income of طبعا suspended losses disallow passive losses that are carried forward indefinitely. Taxable disposition of interest is in the passive activity. Suspended losses are first used to offset the gain in passive income and then subsequently will offset the gain disposition of property. الخسائر المعلقة أو المتراكمة. الخسائر هذا النوع من الخسائر أو suspended losses هي غير مسموح بها واللي راح يتم ترحيلها إلى السنوات القادمة، ومرات يذكرون أنه يتم ترحيلها إلى أجل غير مسمى. التصرف الخاضع للضريبة، التصرف مع هذه فيما يتعلق بهذا النشاط actually يتم لأنه راح يتم استخدام الخسائر أولا لتعويض أي مكاسب في الدخل، ثم بعد ذلك راح نعوض المكاسب من التخلص من الممتلكات الأخرى. Definition of passive activity. كلمة passive activity تشمل any trade or business in which the taxpayer does not materially participate, as well as any rental activity. An important exception applies to the rental activity that is considered to be a real property trade or business. This exception is discussed في هذا الشابتر, and it gives a lot of examples in the book as well. So in identification of an activity, identification of the activity becomes critical for several reasons. من ضمنها من ضمن الأسباب إنه determination of whether a tax buyer materially participants in the activity is determined separately for each activity. A tax buyer may deduct suspended losses of a passive activity when the tax buyer completely terminates his or her ownership of the activity. الثلاثة ذكر لك إنه as explained in a subsequent section of this chapter, tax buyers may deduct currently up to 25,000 of passive losses for rental real estate activity. This is the most important three reasons related to the definition of passive activity. Okay. Tax buyer subject to passive loss rules. The passive loss limitation rule apply to individuals, state, trust, any closely held C corporate or corporation, any personal service corporation, or certain public traded partnership. Because the income and losses of partnership and S corporation are taxed directly to the partners and shareholders, the passive loss rules do not apply لهذا النوع من الانتيتي اللي هي اللي هو البارتنرشيب والاس كوربوريشن. لهذا السبب ما نشوفهم موجودين في القائمه اللي في الشاشه. So rather the passive losses limitation apply directly at the partner or shareholders, those the situation may arise when where one partner or shareholder is subject to the passive loss rules with regard to an activity conducted by a partnership or S corporate, while other partners or shareholders are not. Closely publicly traded partnership, Yeah, in many cases, the tax law provisions for corporation apply to publicly traded partnership اللي هو PTP for purposes of the passive losses rules. Actually, the publicly traded partnership عرف defined as any partnership if interests in the partnership are either traded on the established securities market or readily traded on the secondary markets. If corporate tax provisions apply to a PTP, the passive loss rules generally do not apply. So, however, a PTP meets certain gross income requirements فيما يتعلق بهذا الشأن. Real estate business بشكل عام الرنتال activity are considered passive activity مثل ما ذكرنا في البداية. لكن passive activity laws rules do not apply to certain taxpayers who are involved in real property trade or business. Instead, these activities are treated as activity businesses or active businesses. So real property trade or business involved the development, redevelopment, construction, reconstructions, acquisition, conversion, rental, operation, management, leasing, or brokering of real property. So having exceptions only applies to a taxpayer if he or she meets both of the following requirements. More than one half of the personal services the taxpayer performs in all trade or business during the year are in the real estate or real property trades or businesses in which the taxpayers materially participate. كذلك التاxpayer performed more than 750 hours of work during the taxable year in real property trade or businesses in which the taxpayer material participates. Other rental real estate activity طبعا الرنتال it may deduct up to 25,000 of passive losses against other income. فيجوز لدافع الضريبة ممكن إنه مثلا بالنسبة للرنتال Okay, for this part, many rental real estate activities are not considered rental real estate businesses, and therefore they are subject actually to the passive loss rule. So, however, if an individual taxpayer meets a certain requirement, the taxpayer still may deduct against other income up to 25,000 of the annual losses. في فيما يخص هذه الجزئية يعني ذكر هنا أنه متاح فيما يتعلق في العقار والإعفاءات أنه قد يتم خصم أو يقبل بخصم أو يتم الإعفاء إلى ما يصل إلى $25,000 من الخسائر في تأجير العقار إذا كانت مثلا actively participant owns at least 10% of value of activity إذا كان مثلا يمتلك ما لا يقل عن 10% من قيمة النشاط إذا كانت المشاركة تمت المشاركة بالنشاط. طبعا تخفيض مبلغ ال 25,000 بنسبة 50% من adjusted gross income بما يزيد عن $100,000 of this matter. Casualty and theft losses. Taxpayers may deduct losses incurred in connection with the business or investment property, but individuals generally are not allowed deductions for losses on personal use property. Under section 165, individuals may take a limited deduction if the loss on personal on personal use property arises from a fire, storm, shipwreck, other casualty or theft, in other words losses. الكاجوالتي loss اللي هو الخسائر او اللي حدث ممكن ان احنا نحدده، ممكن يكون مفاجئ او غير متوقع، او اللي يسمونه casual loss. For example, let me think. It's sudden, it's unexpected or unusual. According to deductible casualty loss is one that occurs in indefinable events that's sudden or unexpected or unusual. It just happened. Okay. Because the event that causes the loss must be identifiable. The act of the losing or misplacing property is generally not considered a casualty. However, in some cases, taxpayers have proven that the loss of property was a result of an identifiable events. أمثلة كثيرة على casualty loss. In one of the examples that just comes in my head لما يكون فيه damage، لما يكون فيه حرائق حصلت بشكل مفاجئ، هذا sudden، هذا unexpected or unusual events. According to IRS, a sudden event is one that is swift, not gradual or progressive. Unexpected event is one that is ordinary. Okay, it's unanticipated. Unusual events is one that is not a day-to-day occurrence. Okay, and that is not typical of the activity. وأمثلة كثيرة: damage, losses caused by fire, damage to buildings that caused by an unusual large blast at the near carry or jet sonic room, death of trees, rust and water damage furniture, trees dying because of gradual root system, loss of trees and damage of carpet, damage of clothing, damage of road due to freezing. كل هذه أمثلة on casualty losses and theft losses. Theft defined under the same section. A taxpayer may also deduct the losses sustaining as a result of theft. This includes theft of business, investment, or personal use property. The Treasury regulations state that the term theft shall be deemed to include, but shall not necessarily be limited to embezzlement or robbery or etc. For business investment and personal use property. الثeft deduction دائما يكون متعلق دائما بالممتلكات الخاصة بالأعمال والاستثمار والاستخدام الشخصي. deductible amount and casualty loss. So the amount of casualty loss deductions depends on the amount of the loss sustained. So any insurance or other reimbursements the taxpayers received, and in the case of personal use property, the limitation imposed under the tax law. هنا نتكلم عن measuring the losses. تكلم كذلك في السلايد الماضي عن fair market value and related to the taxpayers that who must use the actual market value, not the sentimental value. So limitation of on personal limitation on personal use property. في بعض الإجراءات. So there we have two limitations: losses sustaining or sustained in each separate casualty must be reduced by $100, and the total amount of all net casualty losses for personal use property is actually reduced by 10% of the taxpayer's gross income for the year. So for property destroyed in the same casualty, only 100 is deducted from the property. So casualty gain and loss is attributed or attributable to businesses and investment property. هنا نتكلم عن taxpayers who must net casualty gain and losses be on businesses and investment property that's held over 1 year. So for discussion في chapter 13 نتكلم عن هذا الإجراء. We are not going to discuss chapter 13, the timing of casualty loss and deduction. So discussing theft losses and insurance of other reimbursements, كذلك certain disaster losses, bad debts. So in addition to losses on property, taxpayers may also sustain losses generated by uncollectible debts. So in dealing with the deduction for bad debt, taxpayers must address the following requirements and issues. A bona fide debitor creditor relationship must exist between the taxpayer and some other person, okay, or entity. Taxpayer must have basis in the debt. The taxpayer our debt must actually have become worthless خلال السنة. The type and timing of bad debt deduction depend on whether the debt is a business or non-business bad debt. So generally, taxpayers may use only the specific write-off method of accounting where when deducting the bad debt, partial or complete recovery for this matter. A bona fide debtor-creditor relationship, he makes it only items for bona fide debts are illegal to be deducted as a bad debt. A bona fide is one that arises from a valid and enforceable obligation to pay a fixed or determinable sum of money and results in a debtor-creditor relationship. Okay? Taxpayers' basis in the debts. For a bad debt to be deductible, a creditor must have basis in the debt. Taxpayers may acquire this basis in different ways. If a taxpayer loans money, taxpayer's basis in the debt is the amount loaned if the debt raises because the taxpayers provide property or provide services for the other party, the basis is the established. It's actually established only if the taxpayers has previously including the fair market value of the property or services in income. To deduct a bad debt, a taxpayer must show that the debt is worthless. This determination is made by reference to all the patent evidence, including the general finance condition that is made by reference to all of the evidence. In providing the worthiness of debt, the taxpayers does not need to take legal action if the surrounding circumstances indicate the legal action probably would not result in the collection of the debt. Non-business bad debt, the distinction between a business bad debt and non-business bad debt is important because the classification of bad debt determines its tax treatment. And business bad debt gives rise to an ordinary deductions, whereas taxpayers must treat a non-business bad debt as a short-term capital loss. So all loans made by a corporation are assumed to be associated with the corporation business. Therefore, the provision for a non-business bad debt do not apply to corporation. This is for this matter. Definition of non-business bad debt. A non-business bad debt is defined as any debt other than a debt created or acquired in connection with the trade or business of the taxpayer, or debit the losses from the worthiness of which is incurred in the taxpayer's trade or business. For the tax treatment, individuals deduct non-business debts that become worthless during the year as short-term capital loss. So the length of time the debt is outstanding has not bearing on this treatment. So the individuals generally prefer to an ordinary deductions rather than a short-term capital loss deduction, because the capital losses are first used to offset capital gain. If the capital losses exceeds the capital gain, the individual taxpayer is limited to an additional 3,000 tax deduction each year. Business bad debts, tax treatment of losses from business bad debt differs substantially from the treatment of non-business bad debt. So as previously discussed, the business bad debt provides an ordinary loss deduction. Taxpayers may also deduct a business bad debt that has become only partially worthless during the year. And accounting for the business bad debts in general, two basic methods are available in this matter to account for business bad debts: specific write-off method and the reverse, or the reserve method. So except for the certain specialized industries, however, taxpayers can use only the specific write-off method for the tax purposes. So under the specific write-off method, the taxpayer actually deduct each bad debt individually as it becomes worthless. طبعا هنا taxpayer ممكن يستخدم two methods. البزنس had bad debts that are either totally or partially worthless, and non-business bad debts that are totally worthless. Recovery of bad debt. Taxpayers may collect a debt that was previously written off for tax purposes, since the taxpayers previously deducted the uncollectible debt. So the taxpayers must report the recovery as as income in the year that it is collected. This is the deposit in insolvent financial institution. There we are going to discuss the net operating losses, which is actually net operating losses under section 170 generally involve only business income and expenses اللي هو NOL يحدث when taxable income for any year is negative because business expense exceeds business income. Deduction هنا net operating losses, it's a raise when the taxpayers carries the NOL to a year in which the taxpayers has taxable income في السنة التي تليها. Carrying back and carrying over periods. We are going to explain this, inshallah. All right, good. Okay, so the starting points in calculating an individual's اللي هو NOL is generally taxable income, as mentioned earlier. في هذا الشابتر, individuals may deduct three basic type of expenses to arrive at the amount of taxable income. اللي هو business related expenses and investment related expenses, well, certain personal expenses. However, generally attempts to measure only the economic loss of viewers by adding back any NOL deductions under certain circumstances. The taxpayers may have taken deductions for it arising from another tax year in computing the taxable losses for the current last year. So allowing these deductions to create or increase the NOL of the current losses year must be increased for these deductions. So after that, we add back any capital losses deductions. So step one, a taxpayer must separate non-business capital gain and losses from business capital gain and losses. Step two, if non-business capital gain and loss exceeds the non-business capital losses that exceeds along with the other type of non-business income, is first used to offset any non-business ordinary deductions. Any non-business capital gain remaining is then used to offset any businesses. Step three, if both groups of transactions result in net losses, the capital loss deductions provided by these transactions must be added back for purposes of the NOL. No deductions is allowed for either business or non-business net capital losses. In step four, if the taxpayer's non-business capital losses exceeds the non-business capital gain, the losses may not be offset against the taxpayer's capital. So we're then adding back exceeds of non-business deductions over the non-business income because non-business deductions do not actually reflect an economic loss from business, that they are not deductible in arriving at net operating losses. Discussing the compliance procedure consideration, and this is the end of chapter 8. Thank you.